Well, welcome everyone. We're so delighted to have you all joining us here today. I'm Laura Nix Gerson. I'm the Director of Women in Worth, and this is Leading Voices, our monthly series featuring groundbreaking women from our community who are leading the charge when it comes to building a more equitable economy for women. With this series and our upcoming annual Women in Worth Summit on April 26th, we host conversations that empower, educate, and inspire women to amplify their worth. You can find more information about our annual summit and speakers online. And if you're in this event with us right now, we're dropping it in the chat. Today, we're delighted to introduce you to, I'm delighted to introduce you to Eva Crouse, staff editor with Worth Magazine. Hi, Eva.
Hey.
Eva oversees the Women in Worth content on our site and in our print publication. Eva, take it away.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you everybody for being here with us today. So March 1st, today is the first day of Women's History Month, and in honor of this, we thought we would delve into a conversation about the gender lens in media. The importance of representation in media extends far beyond gender, including diversity of skin tone and the LGBTQIA community. But since today is the first day of Women's History Month, and we're limited by time, today's discussion will focus primarily on how we represent gender in media. I am so excited to be joined today by Madeline Di Nonno and Adrienne Becker, trailblazers in Hollywood and on stage who are fighting the good fight and making change when it comes to how women are portrayed. Madeline and Adrienne, will you each take a moment to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your organizations?
Adrienne, your name begins with an A. You go first.
Oh, Madeline, I can't say no. Okay. So I'm Adrienne Becker. I've been working in and around entertainment for too many years. And Madeline and I used to work together years ago at the Nielsen Company. But since then, with some amazing partners, investors, started a company called Level Forward. And Level Forward is a story-driven, impact-minded mini studio, for lack of a better word, that develops and produces and finances film and theater and television. And we do that in a pretty unique way, which is with a focus on expanding the access and opportunity of creative excellence. The goals of our work are to further equity and economic transformation, which is particularly relevant, I think, to this conversation. And we are a relatively small company, but have this outsized mission. So that's a little bit of background on Level Forward.
And as Adrienne mentioned, we had the pleasure of working together a number of decades ago, and it's wonderful to see what Adrienne has been doing to really lead the cause. And so for what we do at the Geena Davis Institute, for those of you who may not know, you may know Geena as an actor, but she's been an advocate and the founder of our research institute, which she started back in 2004 with an eye on looking at narrative culture change. So when we watch popular content, whether it's TV, films, or we're playing games, or even ads, who's showing up and how are they showing up? And what she noticed very early on was that although women and girls were 51% of the population in the world of make-believe, they were only like a third of what you were seeing. And so she decided to get the data to really understand if her observations were true. And when we started this, it was about a 3-to-1 ratio. And it's been up and down since then. And we have seen some progress, which we can talk about later. But so we really focus on what's happening in content in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and how can we make sure that the stories we tell are reflective of our population and can be aspirational, as well as a window into the world of work and other things.
Thank you guys so much. You are such incredible women with such incredible missions, and it's an honor to be speaking to you about this today. This topic is something that's actually very near and dear to me, and I just find it incredibly interesting because it affects all of us in ways that we might not even realize. When we're watching movies and TV and plays, we're unconsciously projecting ourselves, whether consciously or unconsciously, projecting ourselves onto these characters. And the fight to improve representation in these roles, I think, is so incredibly important. And so to just kind of set the baseline for our conversation today, I wanted to start by asking you both, what does equitable gender representation mean to you? And why do you think it's important? Adrienne, can we start with you?
Sure. And thanks for the introduction to the importance of the topic, Eva, because one of the things that I always like to say at the top of a conversation like this is Level Forward is only 5 years old. This mission has been going on for decades, really centuries, dating back to the likes of the very early people who recognize that one person being oppressed is all persons being oppressed. And so from, Fannie Lou Hamer to up to Gloria Steinem, we're standing on their legacy as we do this work. Equitable representation is a very broad term for some very specific things. Who gets to tell stories? What stories are told? How are they made? How do people come to those positions? How do they get marketed? How do they get priced? What happens with the profits? And ultimately, all of these little decisions, if not made deliberately, reinforce what we refer to as dominant narratives. And those dominant narratives are what you referenced, what Madeline spends so much time exploring and studying and really understanding, because without that data, we can't measure the marketplace. We can't value the opportunity cost of not having equitable representation. But really the biggest piece of this pie that we don't talk about often is the financing, because the financing comes from such a narrow base that it reinforces kind of like the unintentional and often not completely thoroughly thought through decisions, these micro decisions, which add up to a reinforcement of storytelling that just reinforces these dominant narratives as opposed to uplifting counter narratives. So I think it is thorough. It is not just who's telling stories, it's all the other things and how they come to that, what kind of education, workforce training, pipeline building, all those things. It's also critical because it's identity forming. It's how we figure out who we are in the world. And then it's reinforced by media that we carry with us our whole life that was once formative and is now just affirming. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle. Madeline, I'm throwing it to you.
Okay. Well, I'll pick up the thread of what Adrienne was saying about forming a sense of ourselves and our values and our worth. And very simply put, what happens in the world of make-believe has real world impact. And particularly for us, we concentrate on what our youngest children are seeing, because if you really want to unpack unconscious bias, you have to go young, really young. For anyone who's listening or watching who has children or is a caretaker, you know that children get a sense of themselves, their values, their opinions by the time they're 6 or 7 years old. And if we can imagine a world that is bereft of stereotypes and can be equitable in terms of who we're watching as characters, then perhaps as they develop into adults, it would seem odd for them to walk into a room that wasn't, say, 50% female, and diverse. And likewise have that also inform the kind of content that they're consuming. And so, for us, we know from all kinds of data that people want to see themselves, on screen. They want to be able to identify with that. And by doing so, there's a lot of other, benefits, such as seeing a career that you never thought you could see. We do a lot of work in STEM. And when we did our first study, it was like a 15-to-1 ratio of male characters to female characters when it came to, STEM. And we did a study called the Scully effect, which essentially validated the fact that the amazing character of Scully, played by Gillian Anderson, actually influenced women to go into STEM. And 63% of the women that are currently working in STEM today are doing so because they saw her as this iconic, character. So that's why, for us, it's so important. And we use an intersectional lens. So it's not just about gender, but it's the intersection of gender and race and LGBTQIA, body type, age, disabilities, all of that are the dimensions that we look at. That's kind of lens that we apply when we look at equitable representation.
And Eva, if I could just jump in for one moment, I'm blown away by that 63% of all women in STEM statistic.
Well.
Like knowing Scully, I thought I was just one of those geeky teens, kind of like tuning in every week. But I think I think we're at a point where we're going beyond the cosmetic of like who's in the show and who's telling the story. Because we have all for too long suffered from who holds the pen, not aligning with what the story is about or who is telling the story, in addition to who is making the story, and in addition to where the financial capital is coming from. And this is not about intentions. This is about like practically, where do you get the most authentic work? And how do you support that work in every part of the process? And I think we always get this question about progress. And the progress is clearly stutter step because there is everything that we see. And Gene Davis Institute does great work in capturing what we see and quantifying what we see. And then there's this whole world of what we don't see. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems is the disconnect between what we see and what we don't see. And not having the transparency and the tools to parse that out, to really understand what are the fundamental shifts going on behind the scenes. So an example of this, Level Forward has a metrics dashboard that we put up that talks about like, here's what's in development, here's who's developing it. Here's where some of our funding is going. We're a small company, we make 5 movies a year, 5 shows a year, something like that. Studios have tremendous volume. We are hopeful that these are the kinds of exemplars, these are the kinds of ideas that travel outside of small companies, small women-led companies, small companies led by the people who have been most marginalized, trying to kind of reshape an industry that at its core is most equitable, more equitable than just on what we see, which is like what's on television and who's starring in the films.
And clearly, just to add to what Adrienne was saying, we know from our own studies that when women are in the driver's seat as writers and directors, it could be anywhere from an 8 to 10% increase in on-screen roles. Because logically, if you think about it, storytellers tell stories that they either know or they love. It's either from a lived experience or something that they've been, passionate about. So if it's a 5-to-1 ratio of men to women behind the camera, then of course you're going to see some of the inequities that we've seen in terms of what's happening on screen.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you both so much. Those were such incredible answers to that question. And I think it really lays out something that I've been struggling with, which is we see these characters and we see these storylines in our shows, in our movies, in our media, in all different forms. And there seems to be this consistent narrative going on, but there's actually a whole labyrinth going on underneath that contributes to those decisions being made and those stories getting told. And Madeline, as you're saying, it has a real world impact. And so I think sometimes as a consumer, it can feel a little bit daunting, but also equally inspiring when you see those narratives begin to change. And what I'm so excited to talk to you guys about is how you have actually gone in there on the ground floor and helped create those narrative changes that we've been beginning to see. So going into my next question for you, which kind of brings us up to the surface level a little bit. I do want to get into the nitty-gritty of how all of these decisions get made and how the narrative begins to change. But I want to hear from you guys what you think some character tropes are or typical story arcs that are still prevalent today that you think are harmful and are having that real world impact that maybe isn't the best.
I'm going to throw it to Madeline because she spends a lot of time in the organization exploring this, and I'll just say also the dominant narratives are the easiest ones to conjure because they are the stereotypes and the biases with which we live every day, and they are completely layered and intersecting. So anyway, Madeline, you've got the data.
So simply put, we find that female characters are more likely to be young, dumb, and sexy. I mean, exclamation point. What we have seen on a positive note is we have been able to hit parity for female lead characters in family films and in family television. We hit those, we started hitting parity in around 2018, and then 2019, and then for supporting characters about 2020. Now, given the disruption to the industry because of COVID, some of those numbers have gone up and down, and clearly the theatrical market, which Adrienne could address, has been completely disrupted. But when you look at an intersectional lens, clearly female characters are always 2 to 3 times more to be objectified, hypersexualized. We see an increase and a progress in people of color, but still not at parity in terms of 40% of the US population, if you want to use the US as a benchmark. When it comes to the LGBTQIA community, which is about 7 or 8%, it's 1.2%. Disabilities, which are like 20%, 0.3%. Older population, which again is 20%, 2.5%. So body types also. So there's it's again young, dumb, and kind of sexy. Male characters are more likely to be shown as leaders, with jobs, with careers, all of those kinds of things. We start to see the needle move somewhat, but not where we can all be on a beach drinking pina colada somewhere and saying, okay, we're done. There's a lot of work to be done. And then particularly when you look at the intersection of gender, and race ethnicities, for the most part, we find that most characters fall into a lighter skin color, and less opportunity for female characters to be of a dark skin color. And that's something that we've seen all over the world. This is not a US thing. And so what does that mean? What are we saying about brown people, brown and Black people? So there's a lot of work, to be done to kind of unpack those, stereotypes, and particularly the kind of roles, that, we shape, and the stories that we're telling about Black women or Latino women, not all being relegated to service roles, for example. So there's a lot of narrative change opportunities. And that's what, we really focus on it, particularly with our research tools. That's how we're helping the industry do better.
And let's use your word, Eva, labyrinth, because it's a great word. I wrote it down so I can think about it some more when we're done. Behind that layer of data are things like, what's the average budget for a feature film for a woman first-time filmmaker and a man first-time filmmaker? What are the pay rates for women producers on independent films versus men on studio films? There are so many disparities when you dive deeper into just what the opportunities are for all kinds of women, for every woman to actually participate in, give voice to a story. And that's where those decisions come from, about how many women, what are they talking about, how are they portrayed? And so really thinking about this systemically, we have to dig much deeper into the financing, the producing teams, how we're crewing up, all of these factors that, and then in addition, someone mentioned theatrical, we have distribution. So there's two bottlenecks to equity in our industry, in the entertainment industry, generally: financing and distribution. And financing we've known about, and there are a lot of wonderful efforts underway to broaden the base of capitalism, to broaden the base of stakeholders, and to decompartmentalize stakeholder return and public good. Level Forward happens to be a public benefit corporation. We are mandated by, not a B Corp, we are mandated by the IRS to pursue both of these things as equitably as we can. But what happens is that this word public good or social impact has, or even equity to some extent, has its own stigma, which is, it's going to cost me more money and it's going to take me more time. And so it's a lot easier for me to just like put that woman in the movie or tweak the way she is perceived, or even pay attention to something as like pernicious as colorism, without addressing the root problems of where is the power and how is it being shared? How is it actively being shared?
That's so interesting. Do you find that there is a lack of awareness about all of these different barriers within the media industry for women to get into these decision-making roles? And if so, how are you going about tackling that? And what are some examples of ways that you're working to take down some of those barriers for women on that back end?
Okay, great. Big question.
Sorry, that was a very big, long question.
Big question. No. I may forget a piece of it. Is there an awareness? Yes. Is it talked about? No, not really. And the reason why is that no one in power gives up power. Like, this is one of the lessons that I've learned. You have to actively commit to sharing power. You have to actively commit to learning a new language. And some of the ways that at Level Forward we've tackled this are, we have created a different kind of waterfall model, and it's open source, so anyone can use it. And it is simply this, that instead of financiers and producers sharing in the back end 50-50, they agree to share 45-45, and 10% is carved out for an ally, for an organization, for an entity that is doing the community-based change work. So that you actually, again, you're broadening the base of stakeholders, you're creating a path for economic transformation by potentially putting profits into someone else's hand, who can then go and support and propagate their counter narrative. We also put impact fees in our budgets. And I think we have been able to affect over almost $500,000 of funding going to organizations fighting for equity that are aligned with our various productions. We have, I think, tried very diligently to push the goalposts of these conversations. So to start them as early as possible and to not end them, 1 week after you've had your theatrical debut. The industry has a blind spot, which is we tend to think about these things 3 weeks before something gets released. But that is not
before it goes out into the public eye. It tends
Yes.
to when those conversations are had rather than throughout the entire process.
Exactly. So for example, we have a film coming out on Friday. It's called The Year Between. The filmmaker is brilliant. She is a thought leader. She is a comedian. It is her first film. She also happens to have been living with bipolar disorder for the past 10 years. No one wanted to make her film. She was perceived to be a liability. She, in fact, is the film's biggest asset. Wrote it, directed it, stars in it, produced it. Quadruple threat. But only an organization like Level Forward, our partners at Full Spectrum, would get behind someone like this because it's risky. But in risk comes great reward. One of the things we did is we provided free therapy throughout production to everyone working on the film and for a little period after the film. Because again, you have to think about not just putting people in those positions, whether they're women in a largely male-dominated environment, or they are living with mental illness in an environment that stigmatizes, or they are maybe tokenized because of their skin color or sexual identity. But you then have to support them, and you have to nourish them, and you have to care for them. And we all need that. And so that's part of what can be done to support equitable representation at a completely different end of the process.
That is so fascinating. That's really incredible that you guys were able to do that. And I can't wait to see it. Madeline, I know that you guys are doing some amazing work and have been implementing a lot of really cool technologies that are able to capture data and really drive change in the industry through that. And I was wondering if we could get down into the weeds a little bit of what some of those technologies are, specifically GDIQ and your spell check for bias technologies. I'm so fascinated by these, and I just really want to know what they are, how they're implemented, and what is their purpose? Like, how are you hopeful that or how have you seen them being able to implement real change?
So in looking at narrative cultural change work, which means looking at the messaging in content and the characters, who's showing up, how are they showing up, we were able to very fortunate to partner with Google over a decade ago and received a grant. And the question that we wanted to answer was, could machine learning help us do what we do and go deeper? And the answer to that question was yes, which is how GDIQ came about, Geena Davis Inclusion Quotient. And it was developed for us in partnership with Dr. Sri Narayan, who's the head of USC Viterbi School of Engineering, SAIL Laboratory. And so, funny story, we walked into this lab with all these brilliant engineers, and Geena and I said, yeah, we want a thingy. And this is what we want the thingy to do. And it was like, what? But what it allowed us to do is to use machine learning to extract data from audio and video. And some of the really significant data points for us was, okay, anybody on their hands can count how many female characters there are, right? But are they speaking? Are they given the presence, similar presence to their male counterparts, especially if they're top of the call sheet? So we were able to extract screen and speaking time, in addition to how many are there. And what we found is that when there was a female lead, she was on screen and speaking a third less of the time. And then you start to say to yourself, where's that decision being made? Is it being made by a second AD? Is that decision being made in the editing room? Like, how is that possible across the top 100 largest grossing films in the US? Like, how is that possible? But it allowed us to go deeper. And then the other things that we look at, the other dimensions, LGBTQIA and disabilities and, body type, those things we use what we call our human expert coders, which are all PhDs, which have been trained to do this type of work for decades. So it's a hybrid because, as we all know, AI can't do everything for us yet. And so that tool was good for benchmarking, where are we at? And we were able to report. And that's how, in a short period of time, we were able to show that, okay, this theory of change works, because we were able to achieve gender parity for female lead characters in TV and film in a relatively short period of time, because we've only been around nearly 20 years. But while we were doing that, we thought, okay, this is good for benchmarking, but could there be an intervention? How can we help? Because what's happened over the past 5+ years is all the studios and major content creators have established extremely robust diversity, equity, inclusion executives in the business units, where 10, 20 years ago, all of that was a corporate social responsibility function and HR function. And so once they put these executives in the business units looking at content, now you have something, as Adrienne was talking about, disrupting the creative process, because you have other people looking at content and coming together with the business executives and the creative executives making decisions. And so we went back to our friends at USC Viterbi who had a patented text tool AP, and we came up with Spell Check for Bias, which simply is a diversity, equity, inclusion content strategy hybrid tool. Uses a little bit of AI and a lot of human expert coding. And traditionally, when treatment is done on a script, and Adrienne can speak more to that, there's certain things that people look for. What we look at is who is showing up with dialogue. It doesn't matter if they're a lead or they're not a lead. We look at everybody who's speaking in a script, and we break it down based on gender, race, ethnicity, and all we do is point things out. So you may be doing really well on female characters, but they may be all Caucasian, or you may not have any people with disabilities or any people that are over 50. And we just point out opportunities. And then if there's something that is glaringly sexist, racist, etc., we'll just point it out and we'll give it the literature. And so for those people that are trying to assess scripts on the basis of diversity, equity, inclusion, we have an intervention tool, because it's easier to fix things up front on the front end than on the back end. And it's been very, very helpful. And one of our partners who's been very public is NBC Uni, and they've been using Spell Check for Bias and helping us pilot it for a number of years. And they've changed many, 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 many of their scripts as a result of it. So it provides opportunity to authentically infuse, because one of the things that Adrienne said early on, don't just throw a female in there just so you can check a box. It's meant to stay in line with the authentic voice of the storyteller and not disrupt or invade that. And it's proven to be very, very useful.
And I want to add on to that, because without those tools, we'd be many steps behind where we are now, and yet still so much progress to go. Because imagine those tools are kind of like they're gates, right? They're kind of like they're catches just in case something gets through our system, which is incredibly flawed to begin with. And so you don't have to imbue authenticity if it was coming from the source, right? So how do you find those voices, support those voices finance those voices, produce those voices all the way through. So a tool like this ultimately eradicates itself and isn't necessary. An example of this that just came to mind, and I was mentioning this to you even before, is there's a play that's opening on Broadway any day now. And we are supporting our partners at the National Black Theater. It's called Fat Ham. And it's a riff on Hamlet. And it is the first transfer to Broadway from the National Black Theater in their history. Because there have been so many Black works produced on Broadway, there have been Black films produced in Hollywood, but they actually didn't all come from that place of lived experience. And so it's so important to keep pushing our work and our focus and everyone who's here and listening deeper and deeper and earlier into the process of storytelling. Because it has such an outsized impact, not only on our culture, but also on our capitalism.
That's such a good point. And I know that I would absolutely love to go and see that. I think you guys both make such incredible points about the different layers and the different structures to this process. And even Madeline, what you're saying about how businesses are now including DE&I executives on the business side, it almost seems to me like you guys are providing the data and now there's somebody to listen. Whereas before it might have been providing it to somebody who, they've got a lot of other things going on. It's not top of their priority list, but now there's somebody there to hear that. And Adrienne, to your point, having these narratives within their channels and having it come from a place of authenticity, I think that just hearing you guys talk about this is so inspiring, and I feel like I'm learning so much about the process. And I would actually love to hear from you guys both with the experience that you have under your belt working in this industry and gathering research. Have you noticed any recent trends in the past few years that make you hopeful for the future, that make you feel like, okay, this is a sign that we're moving in the right direction?
I'll throw out an easy one. It's on the tip of my tongue, and give you a minute to think, Madeline. Intimacy coordinators. More and more intimacy coordinators are becoming norms on set. It started in theater. It has been in television, and it is increasingly in film. We have another film called Body Parts, which is excellent if you're interested in this topic of gender representation and really kind of the agency of all women on set around intimacy and around nudity and around consent. So I think the increasing prevalence of people who are focused on making sure that safes are set for women, all kinds of women, is a positive trend.
Absolutely. I remember when that term, the first time I heard that term was in the context of Bridgerton, the Shonda Rhimes series. And I just remember seeing it absolutely everywhere on Twitter, and people were like, oh, what is that? And, all the cast members were being asked, like, what is an intimacy coordinator? And I feel like it took social media by storm for a few days, just like, whoa, like what a concept. And I'm sure, as you said, it's been around for a while, but even just talking about this on a more mainstream platform it does change the narrative a little bit about, okay, what type of experience should people be having on set? I mean, I'm just speculating. I'm not an actor, but yeah, no, that's so interesting. Madeline, what about you?
So from my perspective, as I mentioned, having this different infrastructure to how stories are being actually created and how decisions are being made required all of these organizations, some of them are over 100 years old, to become organizationally ready. And it has to be impact over intent. And so that's what we've seen is, what are they doing to build the infrastructure so that this can be cohesive and it can be part of the process and not this extra thing that I have to do that's going to cost me more money, slowed me down, as Adrienne mentioned early on. And as a result of that, we can see progress. We can see how decisions are being made. And And we're very optimistic about that. Also, what doesn't get talked about a lot is all of the major content creators have programs that they invest in to cultivate writers and directors so that they can be shepherded and get opportunities within their systems. And there's been many writers and directors, diverse writers and directors that have gone on to really have illustrious careers, whether because they were able to get placed, on a show or be given, a budget to do, say, a film project or elsewhere. And so, so we've been excited, to see that. And then you have, leaders like Ava DuVernay and Array Crew and Array Now and what they're trying to do to really help content creators make it easier. How do you find these people? Everybody has their lists. And how do you also cultivate talent that way? And then ultimately for us, the best news is when, we get emails from the public saying, hey, I saw this and it inspired me to do that. Or I didn't know that this could be a job for me. Or the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And really that's what it comes down to is
Right.
How can media and entertainment contribute to the aspirations of the public ultimately?
No, that's such a good point. And I think I really understand what you're saying, where it's not so much about the intent behind the storyline, but the impact that it has. That is the real world implication. And we need to be really focused on that and taking into account what impact this is having on our children, what impact this is having on oppressed demographics, and how are we changing that narrative. I think that's a really, really good point. I'm really curious what you guys think about social media and how it is contributed to changing this narrative from the outside. Or if you think it has at all, or if it's the representation of those broader narratives being changed. I don't know. I find this very interesting, like how those two things interplay.
Well, everyone has a voice. And clearly, that could be good news or bad news. And Adrienne could speak more specifically to this, but, sometimes a film or a TV show can get shot down before it even aired because of judgments, preconceived judgments or notions. And it can be very, very harmful and not truthful. But on the other hand, when you think about consumers and having a voice, by voicing their desire to see more stories about diverse people, to see more people with disabilities, in entertainment and media, and also then rewarding those who are trying to infuse authentically with authentic stories. All the major content players are watching, they're paying attention. So years ago, you could choose to buy a ticket, not buy a ticket. You could choose to watch or not watch, but now you can really voice. And even think about newer-ish mediums like a TikTok and things, people are stating very clearly, whether it's YouTube or TikTok, how they feel about something, and their voices are being heard. So I think it can be very, very powerful, but I think it can also be harmful.
Agree. Disintermediation of authority and populace is a very good thing for freedom of speech, and it has an underbelly which can be very dangerous and rush to judgment. And I think if I were sitting in like in the White House Office of Counsel, like that brings those leaders together, figuring out ways of making sure that people are not creating these insular bubbles, and you're always putting perspective into people's feeds is critical to a functioning participatory democracy. On the plus side, you have things like Letterboxd, like that's all that matters right now on the film side. Like we want to know what people on Letterboxd are saying. And it's great if a big reviewer writes a review that's positive, and if it's negative, we still go back and we see like what are people saying. So I think that's critically important. I just want to circle back to one thing. There is the argument that we need to be accountable for our media. We need to think about narrative cultural change because it's good for us, because we're all daughters and mothers, and we have brothers and sisters and fathers, etc. We have to also concurrently make the financial argument that the marketplace needs this in order to recover from the pandemic, because we are not the marketplace we once were, because theatrical moviegoing is not what it was, because live theater attendance is not what it was, because theatrical distribution, because streaming is not, because all these systems are changed and there's no going back, which is a good thing. And that there is money being left on the table in our industry if we just relegate DEI to that person in the corner and over there, and CSR to this person over here, and ESG to that person over there. But that we look for ways to weave it into the fabric of our work. For example, we have a workshop in partnership with a wonderful organization called Broadway Advocacy Coalition called Storytelling for Social Good. And it is a business to business. It is going to storytellers. It is going to decision makers and saying, let's break it down. What is responsible storytelling? You create a story, it instigates a conversation. Great. Then what happens? Hey, it may disrupt something. Okay, step 3, how do you account for that? And why should you? And what are the incentives to your doing so? And we have companies signing up to understand what this is, because these are the kinds of practices, again, the earlier in one's career, the earlier in the process of telling any story in any medium, the more informed, the fewer blind spots we have in thinking about the power of storytelling and its impact on our culture and our society and our economy.
Thank you so much for chiming in with that. Yeah, it's really interesting to see how the two interplay with one another. And as you noted, the way that we're consuming media is changing so quickly. And the pandemic has been such a big part of that, but also not in a way, and yeah, I think that that's so interesting. And Madeline, what you're saying about how everybody has a voice and creators are tuning into that a little bit more and wanting to hear what they have to say. And that actually brings me to a question that I have for you guys, which is, what can the average consumer do to support equitable representation in media? Is it posting? Is it commenting? Are there other avenues for people to lift their voice and demand a different kind of narrative?
Well, Adrienne, why don't you talk about the business imperative of that?
Yeah. I think I'm going to start with the human imperative, which is audience is the prize. Your time is the only thing. Your time, your dollar is what is your power. And the second you give it up, you must do so intentionally. So consumers need to have greater expectations from entertainment and hold your entertainment choices accountable for their choices. It's really hard to do because there's not as much transparency. So for example, did they employ an intimacy coordinator? We're working on that. Does this production that is riddled with gun violence, did they create a gun neutral offset? Who was involved in this production that's maybe been proven guilty in a court of law right now, but still receiving checks. And we need to make this information more available to consumers, because all the data shows us that consumers want accountability. They just don't have access to the information. So that metrics dashboard and all the companies that are out there that are trying to push the boundaries of transparency, that is really good and really important work. And consumers can take advantage of that. You know, there's a little site that says who passed the Bechdel test and who didn't. There's a partner of ours, Wanuri K, who created the Afro bubblegum test. Like, are those Black women being portrayed in the same way? Are they being portrayed in a realistic way, in a true way? So there are there's Rotten Apples. There are all these tools out there. And I would love someday to be able to make it even easier and bring those tools together, so that it was at your fingertips, and you can make choices quite intentionally.
And from our perspective, for those of you that have children in your lives, I think it's important to pay attention to what they're watching. Lots of times we just allow them an hour of screen time a day, and maybe you've set some controls, but you're not really watching with them. And I think it's really a great opportunity to watch with them. Don't censor, but pay attention. Like, are there female characters? If there are female characters, are they diverse? How diverse are they? How are they contributing? Are they objectified? Is their only purpose to serve in a romantic role? Are they shown playing sports? Are they shown being in STEM? And you can have a conversation and say, hey, you know, do you think this female character could have been, you know, the leader or the heroine, or etc.? Because young children don't have media literacy filters baked into their brain. It needs to be discussed. And we know with mitigation, that type of mitigation, as simple as it is, it has a tremendous effect. And so that's what we would say is pay attention to what your kids are watching and try to watch with them and have a conversation about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's such an important thing. And I personally have been really inspired by the more diverse characters and plot arcs, even just within Pixar and Disney and those very traditional children's movies. And I just think it's really important work, and it's been really cool to see that. We are running out of time, but we have a question from the audience that I wanted to address before we start to wrap things up. So NC says, can there be a rating system to address these issues for the public, similar to the ratings for audience suitability?
Absolutely. And we have some versions of that. Women in Film has worked successfully to create a reframe stamp, which addresses some issues around women's roles in making whatever the film or the show was. But we, to your question, NC, we don't quite have an overarching rating system. Madeline, maybe you know of one in the works, but the rating system, we do need a shortcut for media literacy, because that's what you're both referencing. And Madeline, I'm curious what you're aware of in terms of this question.
So I would say for family entertainment, Common Sense Media for over 20 years has come up with ratings, but based on different categories of appropriateness based on age level. And for parents wanting to know, what should I let my kid watch? I would highly recommend that you take a look at that, because they cover all kinds of topics and subject matters. Because a rating is a rating, but you may want to know if there's violence. You may want to know if there's nudity. You may want to know if there's language. You may want to know if there's very specific things in a piece of content that you may not be willing to introduce your child to at that time. And so, you know, so I would highly recommend it from that point of view. But, you know, you don't have these kind of rating systems outside of the US. I mean, it's really a US thing. There's not even a global, you know, rating system that we can lean in on. But I think you have to look at the context of what are the ratings really telling you, and how's that being defined?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic answer. And oh gosh, I feel like I could talk to you guys forever, and I'm so bummed that we're running out of time because I have so many more questions for you. But we're unfortunately almost out, and I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to talk a little bit about any projects you might have coming down the pipeline for 2023, anything that you're particularly excited about. Yeah, I just wanted to hand the mic over to you in terms of this coming year.
Go ahead, Madeline.
Well, for us, we have a big initiative called #GirlsLeadSTEM. And it's a social media campaign to raise the voices and amplify the voices of girls who are doing really fun things in STEM, and to also reinforce the need to have more girls, and particularly girls of color, pursue STEM education and careers. And it's an initiative we launched last year. We actually wound up as a Jeopardy clue for the month of
That's
October.
so cool.
Most of it culminates for the month of October. So we're really excited about that initiative, and it's a cohort of Lyda Hill Philanthropies and STEM Next and TechBridge Girls and Intel Foundation, a National Girls Collaborative. So there's a cohort, and then we have 70 plus partners. So I would say for any of you on social media, look for #GirlsLeadSTEM, and you'll learn about some really cool women and girls that are doing great STEM things.
Oh, that's so
amazing.
cool.
That's amazing. We have an impact platform called More to Talk About. It is a real space. It is a digital space. Is it a podcast? It's resources. It's hosted by one of and programmed by one of my colleagues at Level Forward, Andrea Ambam, who's incredible. And we have been continuing to use this as a way of unraveling the labyrinth, Eva. And also diving into like, what would those ratings say? But what are the cultural curiosities and implications of a lot of our work? So you can see More to Talk About online, connected to some of the work of the last year and some of the work of the coming year. POTUS, or Behind Every Great Dumbass Are 7 Women Trying to Keep Him Alive, which was a Broadway play that we partnered with some other wonderful companies to produce. And there is an organization called the Anthem Awards, which is in its 2nd year and is acknowledging this kind of work, this kind of social good, stakeholder valuable work. And POTUS launched something called the POTUS Coalition, which was a group of 7 women-led nonpartisan nonprofit organizations that we paired with each of the actresses in POTUS, and that you'll see in the link is More to Talk About. We're excited about The Year Between. It comes out on Friday. There'll be a streaming announcement in the future. Really excited about the destigmatization and our partnership with the National Alliance on Mental Illness out of Chicago to amplify the importance of storytelling and healing. The play Fat Ham, the musical on Broadway Parade, which entertained protesters on its opening preview night, which is part of the work to engage in the conversations, the difficult conversations. Body Parts is premiering on the BBC, I think tonight, or which is amazing. It's an incredible film on these topics. Another film called The Big Payback, which unravels the history of reparations and focuses on the first woman, Robin Ruth Simmons, alderwoman in Evanston, Illinois, who got a reparations bill passed. So lots of good work and
Wow, so many amazing projects going on. You guys are both such incredible powerhouse women, and I have loved talking to you. Thank you so much. This was so incredibly insightful, and I really look forward to following your guys' work and continuing to cheer you on. And thank you to everyone who has joined us here today. We hope you will join us on April 15th for our next Leading Voices event with Jessie Draper of Halogen Ventures and Julie Robleski of Magnify Ventures. And be sure to be in the room with us live in person in New York City on April 26th as we convene for the annual Women in Worth Summit, which we are very excited for.
Eva, can we thank you and congratulate you
Yes,
for all of
thank you
your
so
work?
Appreciate
Appreciate your research and your time
Yeah, thank you so
and all
much.
that you're doing.
Happy Women's Day, everybody.
Happy Women's Day
Women's Month.
Bye.
Bye.